Before we start just today, I just wanted to mention yesterday when I was doing the introduction, in my incredible enthusiasm for having Carolyn, I'd written pages and pages and pages, and when I got to a certain point I thought, well, I'll just stop because everybody's come to listen to Carolyn. So I didn't actually announce all the important things to do with what Carolyn has been doing since being director of Documenta 13, which of course is to be a professor in Northwestern University, which in Chicago, which is linked again to the Art Institute of Chicago and working in relation to their fine art and art history program. Also, she's a visiting professor at Cooper Union, which is one of the most famous art schools in New York. So that what is very interesting is this sort of move from being in the curatorial and museum world to engaging with people in terms of practice, but also as we've really got these big debates. What is the future of fine art education? What is the role of the contemporary as an object of both production and also art historical study and theorization? And what is the role of this new emergent area, the curatorial? Is it just a professionalization of a certain new kind of order, or what kind of practice is it? And Centre Cath has been at the forefront of creating a word which is now so promiscuously used and not acknowledged that it was one of our projects, which was to create the transdisciplinary, which is not the interdisciplinary, but the nature of the encounter that occurs when each area of practice has its own particular ways of thinking through sets of issues, sets of practices, sets of problems. But when they come together in this transdisciplinary encounter, bumping up against each other, not blending and melding into some new third or fourth or fifth category, but having all the edginess of their own distinctive ways, but also sharing the problematics that we are facing around globalization, around commodification, around the fate of the humanities, about the status of the imagination, the question of the digital and the technological and its potentials in the hands of, as it were, informatics people, in the hands of creative artists, in the hands of thinkers. And so it's for that situation we're in here is clearly in the room. I can see we are part of this. You're performing again this transdisciplinary encounter with people doing PhDs in fine art, people who've just completed PhDs in curatorial studies, people continue to work in cultural studies and theoretical, philosophical, cultural aspects, people working in institutions and also hoping to do more in it. So it's in that sense that this institute is of a slightly different order than the lecture, which was really to introduce Carolyn Christopher-Cargive to you in terms of her role as the director of this incredibly significant exhibition we want to keep thinking through and assisting her in thinking what happened when she actually, in the sense that this question of the aftermath. But at the same time, we are now in a position where we are in a seminar format. So this hasn't got a kind of set plot. I thought we would start this morning with having the chance for people who were at the lecture to take up questions, to use questions in response to the overarching view that Carolyn gave us in the lecture, which drew in the many strings of the kinds of readings. And then we're going to look at specific texts and specific ideas so that we get grounded in some of these amazingly interesting new resources for thinking which she has woven together through her particular set of contexts, which are somewhat different from what might be on the mainstream academic agendas of the moment. And I'm looking forward to discussions picking up the question of the feminist underground sources which became the sort of Deleuzian things, the interest in this, debates about speculative realism. So there's some very interesting ways in which I feel the boundaries of my own universe are being kind of expanded or shaken, or the ground under my feet getting a bit sort of more shaky as I think, quantum physics, this wasn't quite where I was, but I'm very excited by all that you've given us to read. I don't believe any of us have read everything. I was going to have readers ready for everybody. I will have readers ready for tomorrow if anybody wants a reader printed out. So I'm going to put a piece of paper around, send around. If you could say, if you want to print a reader, I'll phone my friend and they will be printing them off. we didn't want to print more than we needed or less than we needed, because some people like virtual things, but if you want a full pack, that will be provided. So that, and if you haven't got anything with us, we do have a document reader here, so we can share the versions we've got if you haven't got yours with you today. But we're going to kind of mix discussion and looking and further examination of this brain first off. So I think that's the way we will proceed from here.
I think the first thing I'd like to do is understand who is here, more or less, a little bit. Griselda mentioned that there were people coming from different fields of study or inquiry, or with different obsessions. That would be my way of putting it. So could you kindly, although we all wear many hats, we are many things in different moments or at the same time, nonetheless, could you sort of tell me what you do and who you are? For example, how many of you are also practicing artists or attempting to be so? Okay. And how many of you are so-called future curators or already practicing so-called curators? You can raise your hand more than once if you want. Okay. So everyone else is more in the cultural studies or art history. How many of you are working in an art historical, or whatever that means, manner and fashion? So it's quite half-half. And what about so-called philosophy or cultural studies or critical theory? And you can keep raising your hand like 5 times. Okay. Okay, and is anybody in so-called sciences, working in food or eco activities? 1, 2, sort of, yeah.
He's a string theorist.
So in the sciences, you are in physics.
I'm interested in that field and in art history as well.
Yes. Okay, so there's a minority, I guess, of people that have that background. Well, I don't have that background. I'm an imposter.
Is that turned on?
Yes, it is. Okay, so it's okay. We can all be imposters. We are all imposters. Impostore, we are in another place, always. Anyway, it's just constitutive of being. So, okay. So that said, a few more words on what Griselda's presentation of today. Before we go into, I would like to ask you about your reactions to the lecture yesterday and questions about the brain, so that maybe I can go through some more of the images that we skimmed through very quickly. And but before that, when Griselda mentioned something concerning the background of feminism, indeed, it is true that in most recent curricula, at least in the arts, except for in very small, limited contexts like Santa Cruz, but not even, because art is not really part of the equation around there. But at Duke, with Elizabeth Gross, who has written a few things about art and the animal, or art and materials. But aside from that, it's quite true that in these curricula and spaces, the trajectory of feminist thinking has been more connected with the trajectory of psychoanalytical work and with discursive work and on language and the questions of speech, I think. So, but there is in other universes a very strong feminist trajectory that has to do with science studies. And I think one of the first people in that field was actually Isabelle Stengers, who was a student of Ilya Prigogine. And therefore, her thinking, and she coined the term cosmopolitics, which is a current usage, is important in this. But if one goes to those past periods, there are women that have been working in ethology, in particular before Conrad Lawrence and all that. For example, I'm thinking of Jane Goodall. So Jane Goodall, thinking about the language of non-humans, and other people working in ethology that wasn't admitted as part of philosophy, or it was somehow on the side, on the margin. So that gives another trajectory of thought. So when one thinks of Derrida's text, L'animal que donc je suis, the animal that therefore I am, and then there's another few words to that, one always seems to start there, a discussion. But that's not, and he does not refer to ethology. So he proves the point that he himself is the start of something, and he criticizes and looks at Lacan's relationship with the animal and Nietzsche's relationship with the animal. But somehow to say that all of that is not okay, and now we start something else. But actually, you prove your point by delimiting the field itself, as opposed to if you open the field and see Jane Goodall as part of it, then the field is a very long and ancient one that goes all the way to Montaigne and goes before Montaigne all the way back to Sextus Empiricus and skeptical thought. So that's, but it certainly goes to Mary Wollstonecraft as well. Speaking about this history of feminist thinking, she did write about the analogy between the relationship with the non-human animal and the relationship with the slave and slavery, and used abolitionism as a trope to also speak about feminist, the emancipation of women and women's rights. A very interesting writer today who is at Northwestern, my colleague, such a privilege to meet and to speak with, is Penelope Deutscher. And Penelope Deutscher, who teaches in the philosophy department at Northwestern down the hall, is a person who wrote about Lucy Rigarai's comments and criticism of Nietzsche's usage of the non-human animal and his ideas of vitality. And back to Mary Wollstonecraft, there's an essay that maybe I could add to the reader for next time, when the second lecture is more about these questions of comparing, and Second Institute, the question of comparing creativities in non-humans and humans. And so that reader, we can put Penelope Deutscher. So this is just to say this trajectory in this field goes as far back as Mary Wollstonecraft, but it's a different take on that history that we know. But the other point, even more, as you can see, I tend to open boxes, more and more boxes. There's like all these Pandora box, inside Pandora box, inside Pandora box, inside Pandora. It's like an infinity, a mise en abîme of Pandora boxes. So here we go. But another Pandora box that was just opened is the question of the transdisciplinary, which indeed is not the interdisciplinary. And I fully agree, and I have learned so much also from the Virtual Feminist Museum and so on, thinking about that. It reminded me of a certain impulse in the late 70s in museumology, which brought to the birth of the Pompidou. So the birth of the Pompidou was one of the first experiments in a kind of transdisciplinary project, which wasn't about scientists and artists and poets and writers making works collectively. It was about bringing into the museums all these départements, the département de la parole, and it was really unique in the late 70s in the imagination of the Pompidou, which it doesn't necessarily represent that today, but I think that was a very interesting example of an early idea of transdisciplinarity in the way that it was articulated in the 70s. But my question is a little bit broader than that, I think. I mean, what really moves my putting things that are artworks traditionally defined as artworks with things that are traditionally not defined as artworks, like Anton Zellinger's quantum physics experiment in the Fridericianum, which, by the way, is normal because the Fridericianum hosted, it was a collection of scientific devices also, which are currently now in the Orangerie, but that were collected and brought in by the Hessian princes throughout the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s, who were very interested in all forms of knowledge, constitution, or experience of the world. And so brought in many people, Erasmus, and many people came to Kassel and worked. So the Fridericianum in its original way of being was much closer to the way it was in this documenta than the way it was in the previous documentas, which were partaking of a modernist definition of the field of modern and contemporary art. And that brings me to this last point, which is still a comment. But today we have so much time, so it's so good, and no problems. But so I really think it's interesting for you and for me also to articulate in a reply to this question of the transdisciplinarity. What I'm really interested in, I think, which may be one of the reasons why in this aftermath I'm not making exhibitions, but trying to find people to think about these questions with and through, together with, is I don't know if the a priori behind everything that we do shouldn't be just dismantled. This is why there is the Alfred Gell text, which hopefully we'll read tomorrow or today. I mean, all that we do in fine arts departments, curatorial studies, art history, even when we speak about the many histories of art, the plurality of histories, comparative modernities, is always within this legacy of a Western Enlightenment definition of a field called art, through which the past was looked at, like the cave paintings were suddenly put in as a kind of prehistory before the consciousness that art was art. But we know that art is art, and therefore we can start the story with the cave paintings. In some ways, we are still completely within this a priori, because otherwise we wouldn't be doing comparative modernities across the world, or we wouldn't be trying to find pluralities of histories of art. And I'm not so sure, and because this particular field that we call art is it's intra-actively emerged with the bourgeoisie in the 18th century as a sort of counterpart of a non-instrumental reason versus instrumental reason, productive labor versus non-productive labor, or leisure and reflection. It's in the good education of any bourgeois to work and then to go to the concert. And so this field itself that was created once the cultic function of art collapsed with the modern bourgeois revolutions, which was a completely different, very instrumental definition of art, that art has a cultic function of illustrating the stories of Christ and supporting the power structures and morality systems of a city or whatever, which is much closer to activist political art today, because it's absolutely instrumental art, art for a purpose. I'm not sure that that field can actually survive, or should even survive at all. It doesn't mean it won't, and I happen to be in it, but I think it's worth the question, it's worth the question if in 100 years from now the Tate Modern will exist or not, because it doesn't mean that what the people who are so-called artists do will not exist. Of course, the people, Giotto existed before art was invented, obviously, and so it is not that you will not be there doing whatever it is that you do, but it might be that it's not cut off from certain other activities, or it might be that it is shaken up and redefined, so that all the universities might have different departments completely than the ones that, there might be a department called time, for example, where some people who are artists and some people who are scientists might be just studying time, punto, could be. And there might be some department called matter, or something like that, material, or something, where you have different, I'm not sure how, but I think it's worth the question as a skeptic would pose it. And if so, how can we reimagine that? And the reason the first time I had this thought was when I found a body of a woman on the roof of the Zoological Museum in Rome, which was a very intriguing experience because I was installing an exhibition called Città Natura, City Nature, and it was exploring the relationship between nature and culture in the urban environment. It was 1996. I was working on it for 1997. So you see, some of the things that I do now they go far back. And I gave you a text on Arte Povera because there are things that go quite far back in my experience. And I wanted to use the Zoology Museum to host a work by Mark Dion. How do you say it in English? Dion. And so I asked the director, and he was very happy because no audience at the Zoology Museum and so on. And I was visiting it. And when we went through the whole museum, you know, I was on the roof looking at the city of Rome, and I asked him, well, what's in this crate? And he said, oh, that's a problem. And I said, well, what's that? And he said, it's a woman, a dead body of a woman. And I said, what's that there? He said, well, they forgot it in 1922 when they separated the collections, and they created the Zoological Museum and separated it from the ethnographic collection. So the problem, which if we go thinking about the New York Museum, it's even more crazy, you know, it's even more wild. In the New York Museum, what I would do is not take out, for example, the whole ethnography part. I would just add something about the modern Western humans also in the same New York Museum. So I wouldn't go in the direction of the separation that was made in the 1920s, but I would go in a reshuffling of everything more. But what happened was, when in all over the world they divided these things, they divided the bugs from the humans, they forgot this body. So it's this leftover body, which is like the kind of remembering the fact that the museums were not the way they were today then, and that there was this political correctness in separating the bugs from the bodies that represents the fact that we now have museums of art versus museums of ethnography, and versus museums of, you know, we have the Musée de l'Homme in Paris, and we have the Pompidou, and then we have the zoology or whatever it is museum. So that is the first time it dawned on me that this isn't going to be forever, and that it's like making exhibitions. So that exhibitions are kind of provisional testings of possibilities that then somehow trickle-down effect into university structuring of departments, or policy, cultural policy by I mean, they are human, embodied, situated people who decide to move the bugs and not the body. And they are there today as well, you know, and we vote for them and elect them, and they have different positions and thoughts, and they enact these things. So the exhibition is for me also a platform for thinking about how we can destroy. Speaking about destroying, last night we spoke a little bit about destruction, collapse and recovery and destruction, and the potentialities in destruction, in the sense that I just suddenly heard that maniac saying that the throwing down of the Twin Towers was a great artwork. What was his name? The German
musician Hans Werner Henze. Was it?
No, it wasn't. It was Stockhausen. Yes, yes. So I just suddenly heard myself say that, and I said, "Oh my God!" You know, I didn't mean that. Yeah. I don't mean that. But what I mean is that the exhibitions, or at least what I've done with artists and non-artists, is to make these things a little fragile, to fragilize, that would be the word, to fragilize the fields a little bit and see what happens when one does that. It's a kind of experiment in fragilization. Okay, so that's what I have to say about the fields. Okay, so in the readings of today, this morning I made this little mind map because I tried to be serious about this. I can never really manage to put order into things. I try very hard, but I can't. So what I noticed is that there are some readings that I gave you that are very close to my work. One is the Arte Povera essay from the late 90s, which comes as a culmination of many previous essays on individual Arte Povera artists. They were my mentors, and they were my friends. So I think I learned more from Arte Povera artists than from the university studies, including Marisa Merz, who is a wonderful person. Then I gave you my essay for the Documenta, and then I gave you Judith Barry's essay, a short essay about the brain. And that is one kind of nucleus of text that we can read together, if you wish, and think about. Then there was suddenly this obsession on Karen Barad, and there are 4 things by Karen Barad, including her notebook, for the Documenta, 4 essays, and that, of course, is very close to what we were talking about last night in terms of the infinitesimally small space where thoughts and matter are the same thing because they're made of stuff. You know, a thought is made of a hell of a lot of subatomic particles, and that's one area of text. Then there is this two more on a bigger scale of size, the Jane Bennett, Vibrant Matter, and Lynn Margulis, Consciousness, from this book, Chimeras and Consciousness. Bennett more focusing on the so-called inanimate material, the animation, the vitality in the inanimate, and Margulis on the scale of the traditionally defined as biological, so cells and so on. Then there was opposite, let's say, or in dialogue with this, the Graham Harman, the Heidegger, and the Meiyasu. So after finitude, thinking about things, Graham Harman, also one of the speculative realists, and Heidegger's The Thing. So that sets up the possibility for us to discuss whether there are analogies, what are the analogies and what are the differences what is on the playing field here. Because they organize conferences nowadays, Bruno Latour and so on, organize conferences where they invite everybody who has anything to do with believing that the world exists out there. Everybody who's not entrenched in a purely discursive, theoretical belief that all is language. Everybody who doesn't believe that gets invited to these meetings. But it's time to unknot a little bit and to see the differences and analogies. So these are two kind of groups of readings. On the one hand, Barad, Bennett, and Margulis, and on the other, Heidegger, Meiyasu, and Harman can set up a possibility of discussing that question. And then there's the odd Alfred Gell text, which is about technology of enchantment and enchantment of technology, which is the only text I have found that really questions the a priori of art per se. At the same time, he does it without really knowing what it is art according to us, how we have brought to the complexity of how we see art. So there's a little bit of naivete in Gell's idea of art. So I'd really like to read that together with you and understand what we can use and what we cannot use from it, maybe. But what's most important is that he speaks of this enchantment. And when I speak of the stories in the brain, that each of these objects is somehow, it's not a metaphor, but it's an indicator, it's a pars pro toto, it's a piece for the whole story that can trigger you as a viewer, or me as the person who put it there, to try to find the story. And finding the story takes you away from that object. It doesn't take you into analyzing the form and shape and style, and it takes you away from it. But so there is this double movement of the art object that draws you in order to take you away into storytelling. So what is this storytelling, or this fantasy, which is both in us and in the world, and that allows to imagine the world in a different way, even imagining the fields, for example. So I think that's why Gell is there. So Gell is if one uses Peirce, and we have Bennett, Margulis, Barad as reaction or action, and Heidegger, Meiyasu, and Harman as reaction or action, then the non-reaction is this third thing, this uncontainable that Gell is somehow alluding to. And finally, we have this other group of texts that seems to have nothing to do with all of this, which is the Malabou, Catherine Malabou, the Melanie Klein, the Ashford text about comparing Melanie Klein ideas of aesthetics and art with Adorno and Marcuse's ideas of art and aesthetics, which is a really interesting text. And Winnicott, who is the person behind the notion of the transitional object, which is what I take from Winnicott. And there should have been Bateson, but it's okay. So this area, Malabou, Klein, Winnicott, it somehow reminds us, I think it's essential to be reminded that psychoanalysis does have a really great importance. I mean, that even though one might not agree with a Kleinian vision, which I don't even know very well, so I hope I can learn today because I have an expert here, or more than one. But even though one might not agree with the idea that the whole purpose of art is some sort of internal reparation of this internalized object, which somehow can be whole, it still is useful if one takes it outside of the internal. And she doesn't seem to be interested in the reparation of the object outside of this, of this book. That you tear the book and what happens to this book. It's more an internalized symbolic object. But I think you can use that towards thinking about the question of matter and why matter matters and things in a less simplistic way, because even if we look at Karen Barad and Lynn Margulis and Bennett, there is something simplistic if we do only that. We end up in a superficial, basically, reading of arte povera. When people tell me arte povera is about poor materials and the transformation and use of poor materials and the process of transformation that the materials undergo according to the weather and the temperature in a space, where something will be pink and then it will not be pink, in Azorio, or there's an evaporation occurring in the piece. This is wrong. It's too simple an analysis of arte povera. So to bring into this the presence and the memory of the psychoanalytical attempts at reading meaning or meaning-making processes brings us, first of all, into the sphere of compassion, which is important, and caring. And it therefore can give us something that helps us to read these new materialisms and these things not through, in relation to what humans or non-humans make. That has to do with being with, if that makes sense. So it's a kind of tool. We can use it to compensate a little bit the other readings, which would carry us too much in a physics department or in the traditional or classical view of science. Okay, so that's what I can say about all these texts. And so back to the brain and to yesterday's talk. So what would you like to, or how do we do this? Are there any?
Yeah, I think that was very helpful in terms of giving us a sort of a little guided tour of the mental map that binds or links the two. And I think also what is interesting is when Sybil and I were preparing the reader, which is, I wasn't talking to my friends on my phone, I was just talking to the printer to get the readers going. And I fell directly into the Western trap. I thought, okay, this is how, so that tendency to group, how could I make sense of these readings and group them? Whereas I think very interestingly, now we've seen a kind of different set of conversations, and I think you've laid it out in terms of, from a kind of, we say, an academic point of view, the way we need not to enter into camps. And I know those of you working with the sort of in the MA in Feminism, the visual arts, my absolute refusal to classify what has happened in terms of isms, camps, generations, locations, but that they are these dynamic conversations, because paying attention to this is also, it's important to pay attention to that, and then it's for us to try and see how these two things, which may be very different kind of paradigms and ways of thinking things, are both necessary but absolutely different. They require you to understand their own conditions of existence and elaboration, what they're doing, but at the same time you need that almost in a sense perpetual provocation, what one might call the agonism that exists between different ways of thinking, so that we do not allow ourselves to settle into the worst, I think, of the academic encampment, a very, very kind of phallic model of sort of worshipping the word of or the text of as opposed to thinking with. So I think that's been very helpful. So when you do get the readers, you can begin to see possibly a way of, you know, doing your own journeys with them and using them in different ways. So I think that's very, but I would like to see if we could dig out from your experience of yesterday's lectures. Let's collect some thoughts or responses. And in this point, it's not a formulated question necessarily. It could be a
comment, yeah.
It could be what, you know, you thought just to sign up there's something that was interesting but you couldn't quite get, or what we really would like to have is something, a kind of feedback for Carolyn, and then it'll set up in a certain way. Good. A question already. Okay, now we have to bring you the microphone. Okay.
Hi.
Hey.
I was just thinking about mapping.
Mapping.
Really. There seems to be a lot of mapping in the work, and also particularly in relation to the brain as a key. I don't know what I understood from it as the brain as the objects in the brain as a key to the whole thing, but also the tension between the map and the territory, the map and the whole kind of thing.
That's interesting. Can I turn this map on? How do I?
I mean, like geographically and psychologically as well.
Yes, what comes to my mind, probably to everybody's mind, is the question of the map of the library. I mean, Borges, where the map coincides with the field that one is supposed to map. It doesn't for me. I mean, I'm not attempting to make a map that is on a one-to-one scale with the world. I think that's part of the problem of separating mind and body, is to try to do that. So there is no map. But I think, there's a mind map. I mean, a mind map is not a map, exactly. It's trying to use a diagrammatic language, a notational language, which is not a linear verbal language, to bring together different points in time, in a way. So it's more a map, a mind map, what we traditionally call a mind map, I think is more a map of time, compressed time, than it is of space. Although, you know, you see this distance. The Stande house was from the beginning very important. The Stande house is the alter ego to the Fridericianum, because the Fridericianum was a building that Arnold Bode, the founder of the Documenta, renovated in this modernist, simple style in order to host the first Documenta. And he, at the same time, was renovating the parliament of the state of Hesse. And this is done like 1 year before the Documenta, the Stande House. I think actually, so the first point to say is, I did not make a map. There was no map making. In fact, you don't see a map of the world in the guidebook that shows Kassel, Kabul, Cairo and Alexandria, and Banff. It's almost an impossible map to make. So I think that map making has to do with power and colonialism. And yes, this is the outside of the Stande house, and this is it. This is what Arnold Bode designed for the parliament the year before, more or less, the Fridericianum redesigning. And it's he invented something very important, which is this woodwork that looks like curtains to help not have echo. You know, so it echoes. So it goes in and out and in and out and in and out, so that you can really not have an echo. You don't have to put cloth curtains. And we use these sound panels and things, but this, you can see it everywhere in the world when people do this, just wood going like this. So that was his big contribution. And this curved, very simple space with this light from above that could be closed. It's funny because I'm doing my typical self, which is not answer your question. The thing is, we have a lot of time. I sort of answered it. I said that I think map making is colonial. You know, the theodolite that William Kentridge puts in all his early films to measure the space in a geographical surveyor will use this object. It's like this, kind of like this, and you put your eye in it and you can see straight lines, and you can make the maps of Africa. That's how the maps of Africa were made, with theodolites. Now, the theodolite was invented in Kassel. And there still is the company called Breithaupt. This is one of the many stories. It's interesting because all I want to do is tell stories. So Breithaupt is a company. If you Google Breithaupt, you'll find that Breithaupt, the ancestor of today's Breithaupt, is the company, the man who made for the Hessian princes the first of these surveying devices. And you cannot have colonialism really without it. It's just impossible because it allows for the making of the maps. And today they make the most precise instruments for measuring the depth in mines, for example, in South African mines and so on. If you want the best object to measure depth, you have to have a Breithaupt measuring device. So here we are with the history of technology and the politics of technology and imperialism. And I went to Breithaupt with Henri Sala. Of today, yes. Well, this is a sort of a theodolite, yes. This can be an interesting dance today. We can just do this all day. And I went to Breithaupt to ask them to build the Henri Sala clock. So if you put Henri Sala Documenta 13, you will see the distorted clock which Henri Sala made. Now this clock, which looks like you're seeing it in diagonal, you're actually not seeing it diagonal. It's physically oval shaped, and the mechanism inside is altered so that the arrows of the clock will travel at a quicker speed. For example, it's a quicker speed from 3 to 4 than it is from 5 to 6, because it has to slow down, otherwise it won't tell the time appropriately, correctly, according to standardized time. So basically we redirected the use of technology used for, let's say, military purposes to making this absurd device, which Breithaupt was very happy that got this commission, because he said that his great-great-great-grandfather would get the commission from the Landgraf of Hesse. So my walking into there and asking for this was like a commission centuries ago. So they were extremely honored. And they couldn't make the solution. They could technically build it, but they couldn't find the solution to how to build it. So the solution to how to build it was found by Anton Zellinger, who is the quantum physicist from Vienna, who was my advisor for physics. He was kind of on my advisory committee team, where other people, Donna Haraway was, and Jane Taylor was, and each one somehow covering a certain area of thought. And Anton Zellinger, Breithaupt said that it would have been very complicated to make, an extremely complicated device, because we would have had to make certain different speeds, so certain wheels that, like in a bicycle, you'd have to go on to different speeds. So we could do like 6 different speeds so that the arrows would jump at a certain point and then go into the new speed. And even that would be very complicated and kind of jittery. So in the end, I went to Zellinger and I said, how are we going to do this? And Henri Sala had the image for it, and there's a source to it, which I will show you, but he didn't know how it could be made, which is something, again, very interesting, of the detachment between materials, materiality, techniques, and art making in the post-conceptual era. You know, artists who make videos who don't know how to do video editing, don't know what it is technically. They think that, or you think that, we think that art is somehow the concept of the making of it, and then somebody else has to figure it out technically. So Henri Sala was, on the other hand, aware of that problem and wanting to also bridge that gap. So he spent a lot of time with Breithaupt and with Zellinger trying to figure this out. And it took Zellinger 2 seconds to solve it, theoretically, because he said, well, Carolyn and Henri, the problem is that if you distort the outside but you want to keep the inside with the same system, you have to make an infinity of different wheels to make it perfect, so that it can adapt itself to the outside. So the solution is to distort the inside. So it's a very simple proposition. Of course, if you distort the outside, you distort the inside, there's no problem. It will go at a different speed. So conceptually, that was the result of this collaboration. And then it had to be put into practice, and then Breithaupt could figure out how to distort the inside so that it would work. Now, to go back to mapping, as you can see, I'm not so interested in making maps, but I'm interested in the collapse between the spatial and the temporal. In fact, there is no difference between space and time. In fact, the black hole is all time together, or no time. So it is a priori of common sense that somehow there's this geography, and then there's this thing called time and this thing called space. But it doesn't really work that way. Not only does it not work that way in our poetic life in Virginia Woolf, but it doesn't work that way, and not only does it not work that way in our philosophical thinking around time. So we have Bergson and thinking about time as a flow, duration, or Bachelar's development off of Bergson. It also actually in the real, so-called real world, it doesn't work that way. So you can't make a map of something that doesn't exist. So you can't make a map of space. It's impossible. It doesn't exist. Space doesn't really exist, nor does time. So I think that is the answer to the refusal of making the map, but yet the allusion to the map. So it's the non-made map. It's the thirdness. It's the position of thirdness in terms of the map. So you might think there is a map and try to make a map between Banff, Kassel, Cairo, Alexandria, and Kabul. But these positions in this map are mobilized by the Documenta 13. In fact, they are associated with positions of the selfhood vis-à-vis the world. The 4 positions that I arbitrarily chose in opposition to the traditional positions, the 5 positions of dance, or the 2 positions of active and passive in classical action analysis, or the 3 positions of Peirce. The 4 positions that I arbitrarily chose, could have chosen others, are siege. What does one do when one is in a state, when one is besieged by others? Kabul, you could say. What does one do when one is on a stage? Castle, one might say. What does one do when one is on retreat, like Banff, where there are more bears than people? What does one do when one is in a state of hope, which at the time, less now, but at the time was, or just in the middle of the Arab Spring, was of course symbolized by Cairo and Alexandria for me. And I looked at what artists do in these various positions, when they hold these positions, but actually the whole proposition was to mobilize them and to cancel them out, which I will tell you in a second. But if one is in a state of hope, for example, Malevich, one doesn't do what traditionally is called art making. One becomes an activist and applies one's aesthetic abilities to making teapots, tables, the Paris bar for the workers that one applies oneself to the imaginative rebuilding of one's world and society. Today, one goes and plants seeds in Detroit and starts a whole activist art project. So the state of hope brings you to do things which are not the classical artistic practice of the studio and of the so-called art making. It's more the applied aesthetics position. The state of stage brings you to performing and to being on stage, the performative. So it brings you to doing lectures and talks and performances. And it is the most classically identified with the subject of multitude in many essays. For example, Virno's writings around Glenn Gould. And he says that because we are precarious laborers, we have to always perform. Like, I have to have some new idea in 2 or 3 years, or I won't be able to come and teach here, or I won't have anything new to say. And so you have to be able to reinvent yourself and be constantly in this performative state of the virtuoso. He calls it the virtuosic, being on stage, to survive, because otherwise we will die. We have no pension plans, we have nothing. We will have to legitimize and pass laws on euthanasia, which is, again, in this my being Adornian, I always see one thing and it's opposite. I mean, of course I believe that people should be able to kill themselves when they want to at a certain point if they're very ill, and I don't believe in putting tubes onto terminally ill people for the pleasures of the medicinal art market and industries, pharmaceutical industries, the money going to the hospitals, and the pleasures of some relative wanting to hang on to this dead life. Of course I believe in that, but I also see that behind that, as behind divorce, did we speak about divorce in the, no we didn't, well, behind this question is also euthanasia is also the new laborer that should be destroyed when there's no more performativity. So you have to you abolish pension plans and you put in the laws for euthanasia, so you control the overpopulation of the world, and you basically tell people that they are freely choosing. Whereas the same way that you tell them they're freely choosing to be free from the Fordist assembly line by being able to do their work at home. Oh, yes, you are free to do your work at home, wonderful. You know, complete 24/7 slavery, as Jonathan Crary just summarized very well in his new book. So the stage is the closest to that whole debate around what you have to do to survive. It's like outrageous. And it, of course, is Kassel, because Kassel was the exhibition place, the primary venue of the Documenta. So it is the stage par excellence for an artist, more even than the Venice Biennale, or like the Venice Biennale. Banff I chose as an embodied place to think about the position of retreat, because it is a retreat. It's a place where artists and scientists, mathematicians are invited, and they get this grant, and they go and they spend a month, or they do their meetings there, the mathematicians every year in October, the artists in the summer, and it's in the mountains, and it's a ski resort and all that. And of course, behind all of this is the massacre of the indigenous peoples of the region and a whole bunch of things. But and there's a ski resort nearby, you know, Marilyn Monroe, where there's pictures of Marilyn Monroe and so on and so forth. But it is also a retreat, and makes us think about what occurs of vital also in terms of reading and thinking together and working. And in fact, in Banff, what I organized was a workshop on ceramics. So instead of being a place for thinking together, there was also Catherine Malabou came and participated in it, and Pierre Huyghe came and thought through his piece until, so there were lectures. Chus Martinez gave a lecture and so on. There were lectures and discussions around the position of what it is to be on retreat as a positive state of being, which brought us all the way back to another place, but not on the map, off the map of Documenta. I would say that it's off the map, to answer your question, as like off the grid. So we were talking, one of the places that was off the map was in the background of Documenta 13 was the Monte Verità. That's another story, but I might tell you about the Monte Verità near Ascona in a moment. So if you take this flat map of Banff, Kassel, Cairo, and Kabul, you can also create a crystal by making, if I could make an axis going this way, I would make an axis coming out this way, and I would put Breitenau right here. So I would make this other axis that goes Breitenau, Kassel, Monte Verità. And so let's just try to make it like this. Well, we can use a different color. That's how I use the colors. I think colors are great. So we go like this. So here we have Breitenau, And here we have Monte Verita. Okay, and I will tell you about that in a minute. But in the first flat map was this Kabul. So Kabul was associated with the position of being under siege, because we would associate that now with being under siege, because there are drones bombing Afghanistan on the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Kabul has been under siege for decades, for centuries. It is the place of the great game, you know, the famous great game between Russia and this place, and so on, having to do with primacy. It's a very particular place that ever since antiquity is a crux and fundamental geographical area connected to the trade routes. This famous Silk Route went through there, and it's fundamental because, yes, that's a good one. It's fundamental because you have this Hindu Kush, and there's a very specific, you see this piece of the border of this map? This is useless to see as this map. But if you see it in the real, this is a very narrow corridor between mountains, which connects China to the west. And the Silk Route goes through this. And then it divides into two. One goes through the valley of Bamyan, and one goes a little bit under. So these are trade routes, these are economic routes, these are routes of power, these are routes of colonization, these are routes that from antiquity, from the times of Alexander the Great, who arrived he married actually Princess Roxana. There's all these stories. She was from Afghanistan, Roxana. She was a Bactrian princess, Bactria. Actually, the Bactrian princess, so there's many Bactrian princesses. And anyway, this whole thing, which today is the terrain of contestation of the balancing of powers between China, India, and the West, via, of course, Iran. So there are, of course, all the reasons for it being, but it has been besieged for thousands of years. And the Afghan people that didn't really exist until the Great Game, until the British colonization of the East didn't really exist, because there are 150 languages in Afghanistan, 150 different people, the Hazara, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, and within the Uzbeks, the Pashto, and so on. It defined itself as a national identity in the late 1700s in antagonism to this colonization of India, basically. I mean, Afghanistan was the part of India that was not colonized by the British. They couldn't get any further. And it has much to do with the orography, the geography of the area, and so on. So Peshawar, the British Empire went to about here, where north of Peshawar, and included what Pakistan is today. So besiegedness. So it's been under siege for a hell of a lot of time. Now, the reality is, though, that this simplistic map was only made for the purpose of mobilizing it. Because actually, when you are in Kassel now as an artist, you are certainly besieged. I mean, if you consider the art system that we are in, the financialization of art, the growth of the art fairs and the auctions, the Basel Art Fair, and so on, you are in a world. You are in a mental state of besiegedness, but you are inside this citadel that is the Documenta, a sort of protected citadel. You are also on retreat, obviously, from Basel and all that stuff. And you are also in a state of hope, because when an artist encounters Documenta, generally there is not the same impulse of negativity and institutional critique. It's very rare that an artist will make a project of institutional critique in Kassel. It happens, but they will make projects that reveals, for example, the military history of Kassel. For example, Thomas Hirschhorn did in his piece during Documenta 11. You will have such things, but it is not common to have an artist make a proposal against Documenta. And that is because Documenta is kind of in a state of hope. It is felt by artists as being an artist's exhibition. And that is because of the number of works that have been made. It is because of the conditions from which it emerged it was thought up by Bode in 1949 and then finally realized in 1955 as a engagement with the modernist internationalisms, the modernist avant-garde idea that art was an international language, abstract because it didn't speak a specific language of any specific place. It was across the borders of culture, and through this international terrain of abstract language, we could build a shared community, which is not verbal language, but is on the level of the body sensation and form. So it is the utopia that continues from the early 20th century avant-gardes all the way into Rudolf Arnheim's ideas and analysis of form and shape, and the abstract work of the artists who were working at the time that Documenta was born. So informel, abstract expressionists, and so on. So it is a bit in a state of hope, and it's also in a state of hope because of the works that remained from the previous Documentas. For example, the trees that Beuys, that Joseph Beuys planted and had planted. He didn't plant them all personally, it's not that narcissistic, but there were these 7,000 stones, basalt stones, in the Friedrichsplatz, and the proposition was to progressively replant, reforest the city from 1977 to 1982, from one Documenta when he started it until the next Documenta. It was completed, the project of planting all these trees next to a stone. Each stone is like a marker for the planting of the tree, and his vision was that progressively the trees would grow and the stones would remain the same size. So it was a metaphor a little bit about the relationship between the artist and the world, in the sense that the political relationship, that you do something like cut the stone and you position it, and it has a certain size and it takes up a certain amount of space, visual, intellectual, mental. Progressively the tree will grow, and that space of the original impulse made by the artist will become smaller and smaller in comparison to the flourishing of the trees, and then slowly we will forget the stones almost. They will be there as small markers. Because of works like that, or like the Walter de Maria Earth Kilometer in the Friedrichsplatz, which still exists, which is a piece done in the 1977 Documenta, where he redirected technology, like what Henri Sala did with the Breithaupt factory. De Maria used the technology used for drilling oil wells, and he drilled a small hole into the Earth's crust 1 kilometer down. Now, as we know, I think the Earth's crust is something like 6 kilometers, not so much more. So this one artistic gesture, which was a very embodied gesture, it was not a conceptual artwork, it was physical. This one, this is when they're starting to do the whole, actually, this is what it looks like now, but the drilling of the Earth Kilometer, you have these big machines, you know, just like drilling an oil thing, this is after the hole is made and you're cementing around the hole. This is just at the end of it. But this artistic gesture of piercing the crust of the Earth 1 kilometer, so bringing it 1 kilometer closer to a hole out of which the lava comes, I mean, this magmatic stuff erupts, is somehow understanding how we are on a skin, you know, we are on a very fragile space that we feel when there is an earthquake and thousands of people die, not just in very distant lands, but also in the core and center of the Eurocentric life, you know. When in Abruzzo the earthquake happened, many people died and many churches were destroyed just a year or two ago in Italy. So the fragility of the Earth's crust was part of the project of Walter de Maria to understand that we are on this thin, it's not just a problem of the environment around us, it's also to understand that we are guests on a very thin layer of, that is at the core of that piece, which all works like that, and I won't tell you other ones, but that remain after the Documentas. I could tell you some of the ones that remain from this one, if you ask, and how they dialogue interestingly with these past works. Made it, for me, a kind of space of hope. But, oh no, we were here. Yeah, mobilizing these 4 things. So stage, retreat, hope, and siege are all in castle. You know, every time you do a documenta, you don't know if there's going to be another one. I mean, will the German government cut the funding for that, as every other place in the damn world has cut funding for the arts? How can you do this balancing act to just one more time? Can we do it one more time? And then it's again, can we do it one more time the next 5 years? And so, but Kabul is also a retreat. During the whole process of working on the documenta, when Francis Alice and Goshka Machuga and Lara Favaretto and Adrian Villarojas and Mario Garcia Torres, we would go back and forth to Afghanistan for years and years, you know, and it was always in discussion. One thing we can discuss: what is the Orientalist impulse in this? What is the neo-colonial instrumentalization of a distant land in wanting to do a project there that is a European originating project? In what way is it that? In what way is it not? Now, I always, as a kind of Adorno kind of figure, I always believe that we are full of contradictions, and there are elements of all these things as well. But the point is to recognize them and to keep them at bay in the ways that one then cares, in the choices that one makes in the context where one is going to operate. Because the solution is certainly not, oh, well, let's just boycott every place that is a zone of conflict or where there's, you know, an occupation by the West. We're just not going to do anything there. What's the point of that? It's isolating even more. And I asked myself, would I have done a project in Auschwitz? I think I probably would have. And if it had come from the Nazis to ask me, would you curate a show in Auschwitz? Well, what if I said no? Salah Hassan would have said no. I had many discussions with Salah Hassan, who was also one of my advisors, I think, or at least he was an unofficial advisor. And he said, no, I will not do an art project in Ramallah today. And I disagree. I actually disagree. I think that I would have done it because I think that it is never clear who is instrumentalizing who. And if you complexify things enough, you actually can reverse the instrumentalization. This I learned from my life in Australia, because I learned it from a bunch of different indigenous people in different parts of the remote communities when I would discuss this business of the paintings and the dot paintings. And I would say, but don't you realize that this is like tourist painting? This is just done to create an image of Australia that's not racist, and for the world, you know, you put it on the Qantas planes, the dots, we are so good, we are not bad, we are not racist, we have this wonderful culture that we celebrate. Don't you see that it's instrumentalized by that? He said, well, it's a question of time. It's not clear who's using who right now. I mean, it's only been 200 years, 300 years. They're not necessarily gonna, I mean, it depends what happens over 1,000 years. That's important. And actually, we are getting the, first of all, there are a lot of people who like painting and who would be drinking and taking drugs in the remote communities because there's no work possible, because there is not one owner of indigenous land who is able to exploit their own mining, for example. All the mining is always done through companies that use the territories, but the profits don't go to one single indigenous family. So obviously there is no work. And the second thing was, well, you know, how do you think we paid for that dialysis center? In Alice, you know, otherwise until we paid for that dialysis center with the sale of these paintings, we weren't able to, we had to fly our people 700 kilometers to Alice Springs, which is in the center. So that makes a lot of sense to me in a Boycean way and in an activist art way. And it makes a lot of sense in also going away from this modernist idea of the object artwork as this kind of religious belief in it as some sort of space of form, but actually seeing the art object as a tool of exchange or a tool for many other things. And once you can do that, demystify the art object, then you can also look at the fact that many of the paintings that were in the Documenta by Doreen Reed Nakamura and others are actually, on a Rudolf Arnheim point of view, pretty damn interesting in terms of balance, symmetry, asymmetry, weight, all the things that we can look at as within Western formal analysis. They're pretty good, which is why Sol LeWitt was one of the big collectors of indigenous abstract paintings, and they influenced Sol LeWitt's last works, which is obviously not written about in the text about Sol LeWitt's late works, ever, you know. But that's okay. So back to the map question. So it was about mobilizing. So Kabul was also a space of hope, clearly. You know, we were there working together with Afghan diaspora artists that returned because of this project, many of them. Like Mariam Ghani, it gave an opportunity to Mariam Ghani, who is an Afghan diaspora artist, teaches video, in fact, at Cooper Union sometimes as well, and to go back and to do projects, workshops there, because we provided the possibility. And in particular, what she did, which was extremely interesting, was a workshop bringing together the young video makers of Kabul and Afghanistan, who are the best in the world because they get all this training, because the Western news agencies want these local people there to work. They don't want to send in camera people and send in video editors. So there is an extremely high technique known by young people in Afghanistan around video, much better than I've seen anywhere else. To bring those people together with the old people who survived from the Afghan film. Afghan film was highly developed during the Soviet period, and also prior to that during the American period. American period is 1950s and 60s. Soviet period, as you know, is the late 70s through the 80s, the Civil War. So until the retreat. During the Soviet period, there were massacres, tremendous deaths, and millions of people died because the Soviets wanted to modernize Afghanistan very quickly, rapidly, and did things like you couldn't go to the movies in traditional attire. And if you didn't have modern clothes, you had to rent them outside the cinema. So there was an incredible amount of oppression, which brought to the backlash, of course, and the intense return of religion. But it also, one of the great things of the Soviet period was the development of Afghan film and the building of Afghan film building and so on. And during the Taliban era, which is the backlash era, you may have learned that the Talibans destroyed the films. They burnt all the films, and you saw pictures on the news of these film strips hanging from trees and so on in Kabul, and against representation and modern evils such as film. Now the reality is that a man called Engineer Latif, who is also a cinema filmmaker, I could just tell you stories for 2 days, but we're gonna not do this because you have to control the storytelling. But Engineer Latif, who was one of the most important filmmakers of popular films, love movies and things in the 60s and 70s and 80s, he's the director of Afghan film. And what he did when the Taliban came was he locked all the negatives in a room, which was in the corner of the building. So the building, let's say, is like this, and you have halls everywhere. And in this room, he locked all the film, so that the halls, when the Taliban were going through, he was showing the Minister of Culture, Taliban Minister of Culture, so they went into all the rooms, and your body doesn't realize that there's a hidden room. Even if it's in the corner, you just don't really realize it because you can't tell how big this one is versus how big this one is. So he saved all of the negatives of Afghan film, and he put out some positives in some trucks outside. So, but not all the positives, just some, like 70% of the positives, or it was the other way around, 30% of the positives. The facts are all wrong, my numbers are all wrong, but it doesn't matter. And they destroyed those and burnt those. So basically, but in the meantime, all the machines to make copies, to make an internegative, and then to make a new print broke, and so on and so forth. So that's fine, I'm just telling stories, it's fine. So what happens is that what Mariam Ghani, the diaspora artist, Afghan-American diaspora artist who's lived most of her life also in Kabul. It's not that she has a home and her parents live there. You can see her website. It's called Kabul Reconstructions, I think, or something. If you Google Ghani and then Reconstructions, you'll see her website and many of the projects she's done, like recording the Loyal Jirga, the famous first Loyal Jirga after the Taliban period, and she made a kind of videos and documentaries and things. Anyway, what she did was, her idea was to connect the young video makers in Kabul, which are excellent, with the older people who used to be the camera people or the directors or people working at Afghan Film, who still work at Afghan Film. They have their monthly salary, to teach one the other techniques. So to teach the young people how to deal with film, analog film, and to teach the older people how to also make digital copies and digitize. And we bought a digitization machine for 10,000 euros, which is not a huge amount of money for Documenta. We can talk about money too, because that's tomorrow maybe. But I usually get the question, but don't you see that you're using all this money which should go to hospitals? And I will have to give you a lesson on the funding of Documenta and how it works as a win-win situation. And takes no money from hospitals. But I will tell you that tomorrow because it's so boring to talk about money in a way, and it's also fundamental, so let's just psychically remove it. But the 10,000 euro machine served to digitize, and she did these workshops, and indeed they archived, and there is actually an online archive now. They scanned, digitized, archived, made the internegative machine work, beginning of the systematizing the whole Afghan film reserve. And what that means is that the Documenta was only like a propeller. Documenta 13 initiated this. It's like putting the startup possibilities. But it continues now, and they can apply for other funding. They've gotten it. So the project continues beyond and after the end of Documenta. Part of the aftermath of Documenta is that Afghan film is being all taken care of. And what that has to do is with other stories that we might tell. You know, the stories of Kabul in the 70s, the stories of Kabul in the 50s, all these stories that are very different from the stories that the media wants us to know about this history, you know, this sort of retrograde, primitive place of people burning wood on top of a hillside and, you know, and repressing women by not letting them go to gynecologists. And I mean, it's of course true partly, you know, especially during the Taliban period. But this history of documentary footage and film tells a very different story of the 20th century in Afghanistan. So one needs to also understand that the cause of a lot of that violence on women's bodies and stuff comes also because of the conflicts and demise that happened from the mid-70s onwards. And be very careful. There's a very interesting essay by a California, Santa Cruz, what is her name, around the also manipulation and use of the oppression of women in Islamic contexts. You know, the discussion around the veil, the kind of conservative usages of this critique. That, what is her name? I will remember and tell you. But to go back to this map, so it was very much about mobilizing Kabul as a space of hope, also a space of retreat. You know, we were discussing and talking about the Boetti One Hotel and Mario Garcia Torres's work around the notion of retreat and the One Hotel of Boetti. We can talk about when we show slides of the brain. Was what's the other one? Hope, stage, retreat, and siege. Yes. So, and all four here, all four here. So this constant slippage. So it was just as much, it was more about unmapping and mobilizing maps and embodying and situating experience than it was about maps. And that's how I see mind maps. Actually, they are not maps, you know, because the map is connected, yes, with measurement. So I hope that answered your question partly. Okay.
Just listening to you speak there, it seems to me that this space-time model that you've got, you would have to have the 5 years of Documenta, the run-up to Documenta, to enable this kind of structure, or it does enable this kind of structure, because you've got a long run-up to having to display to the world what it is you were thinking.
And display only part of it.
But that's right, display
Yeah.
only part of it, and make known that there are all these other locations. So it seems to me that documentary is a great
Tool for that,
opportunity
yes.
or tool for that, for precisely that kind of space-time.
Yes,